Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might surprise you. The most boring way to get rich that ever existed. We're talking about ancient Rome, where fortunes were made not through apps or crypto or viral videos, but through the slow, methodical accumulation of grain, olive oil, and human misery. This is the story of how ordinary Romans became extraordinarily wealthy, using methods so tedious, so mind-numbingly repetitive, that they'll probably put you to sleep, which is exactly the point. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing in the Forum Romanum on a sweltering summer day in 150 CE. The marble gleams white under the Mediterranean sun, and the air buzzes with the sound of commerce. Merchants hawk their wares, slaves shuffle past carrying amphora of wine, and somewhere in the distance, a senator's litter bearers grunt under the weight of their passenger. But here's what you don't see. The invisible networks of wealth that made all of this possible. The boring, methodical systems that transformed dirt-poor farmers into the richest people in the ancient world. Because while gladiators fought for glory and emperors conquered for fame, the real victors of Rome were the ones who understood something far more powerful than any sword or legion. They understood that true wealth comes not from dramatic gestures, but from the relentless, almost mind-numbing repetition of profitable activities. Activities so dull that historians barely bother to write about them. Activities that happened in dusty warehouses and muddy fields, far from the marble columns and golden eagles of imperial pageantry. Tonight, we're going to explore 3 of these methods. 3 ways that Romans got rich that were so boring, so mechanical, so utterly devoid of excitement that they became the financial equivalent of watching paint dry. But they worked. They worked so well that they created fortunes that lasted centuries, built trading empires that spanned continents, and established family dynasties that outlived the empire itself. The first method was perhaps the most tedious of all. Grain speculation. Not the dramatic high-stakes trading you might imagine, but the slow, methodical buying and storing of wheat, barley and other cereals during harvest season, then selling them months later when supplies ran low. It required no special skills, no connections to the imperial court, no brilliant innovations, just patience. Enormous, soul-crushing patience. Marcus Crassus, one of the richest men in Roman history, didn't start with fire brigades or real estate, despite what the history books tell you. He started with grain. As a young man, he would spend his days in the countryside during harvest season, not enjoying the pastoral beauty or the satisfaction of agricultural labour, but calculating. Always calculating. How much grain could he buy with his modest inheritance? How much storage space could he rent in the city? How long could he afford to wait before selling? The process was mind-numbing. Wake up before dawn. Walk to the granaries. Inspect the grain for quality, checking for weevils, moisture, mould. Negotiate with farmers who spoke in thick rural accents and counted on their fingers. Arrange for transport, dealing with cart drivers who moved at the speed of oxen because they literally used oxen. Then wait. Wait through the autumn. Wait through the winter. Wait as your stored grain sat in dark warehouses, slowly appreciating in value while you paid storage fees and worried about rats. But here's the thing about boring methods. They work precisely because they're boring. While other young Romans were pursuing glory in the legions or trying to make names for themselves in the courts, Marcus was content to be forgotten, content to be overlooked, content to let his wealth accumulate as slowly and quietly as sediment settling at the bottom of a river. By the time he was 30, Marcus owned more grain storage capacity than any other private citizen in Rome, not because he was brilliant or charismatic or well-connected, but because he was willing to do something that everyone else found intolerably dull. He was willing to wait, to calculate, to inspect grain shipments with the enthusiasm of a man auditing tax records, and it made him so wealthy that he could eventually buy his way into the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey. The second method was even more tedious, if that's possible: olive oil production. Now you might think this sounds pastoral and romantic, working with the ancient olive groves under the Mediterranean sun, but the reality was far different. Olive oil wealth came from understanding the most boring aspects of agricultural timing, processing efficiency, and storage logistics. Take the case of Gaius Tullius, a Roman whose name you've never heard because he never commanded legions or built monuments. Gaius made his fortune through the mind-numbing process of olive oil optimization. He spent his days not in the olive groves themselves, but in processing facilities that smelled of rancid oil and echoed with the monotonous grinding of mills turned by slaves and donkeys. The process began with timing. Olives had to be picked at exactly the right moment, not too early when the oil yield was low, not too late when the flavor turned bitter. This required Gaius to spend weeks walking through groves, examining individual olives with the intensity of a jeweler inspecting diamonds. He would squeeze them between his fingers, testing for firmness. He would taste them, making notes in wax tablets about subtle variations in flavor that most people couldn't even detect. Then came the processing. The olives had to be crushed within hours of picking, or the oil would develop off flavors. This meant coordinating teams of workers, managing multiple pressing facilities, and maintaining equipment that broke down constantly. Gaius spent his days troubleshooting mechanical problems that would make modern engineers weep with boredom: a bearing worn down on a press, a lever that didn't provide enough mechanical advantage, a settling tank that leaked precious oil into the dirt floor. But the real tedium came in the storage and aging process. Olive oil, like wine, improved with time, but only if stored under precisely controlled conditions. Gaius had to maintain dozens of storage facilities, each one kept at specific temperatures and humidity levels through primitive but effective methods. He would visit each facility daily, checking the oil for signs of rancidity, adjusting ventilation, rotating amphorae to ensure even aging. The profit margins were thin. A single batch of oil might take 6 months to process and age properly, during which time Gaius had to pay for storage, labor, and transportation, while seeing no return on his investment. But he understood something that his competitors didn't: small margins, multiplied by enormous volume and consistent execution, created massive wealth over time. By middle age, Gaius controlled olive oil production across 3 provinces. His name appeared on amphorae found in Britain, Germany, and North Africa, not because he was a great general or politician, but because he was willing to spend decades perfecting the most boring aspects of oil production. He knew exactly how long to age different varieties of oil for optimal flavor. He could predict market demand months in advance based on harvest reports from across the empire. He had memorized the carrying capacity of every type of transport vessel and the most efficient shipping routes to every major city. The third method was perhaps the most mind-numbing of all: slave-based manufacturing. Not the dramatic gladiatorial training that Hollywood loves to portray, but the tedious, repetitive production of everyday goods in workshops that operated with the mechanical precision of ancient factories. Consider the case of Lucius Vestorius, who built a fortune through the manufacture of ceramic oil lamps. Not artistic masterpieces or luxury items, but the most basic, utilitarian lamps that every Roman household needed. The process was so repetitive that it could drive a person to madness. Clay had to be mixed to exact specifications, shaped using identical molds, fired at precise temperatures, and finished with glazes that required perfect timing to apply. Lucius spent his days in workshops that were hot, dusty, and filled with the sound of pottery wheels spinning endlessly. He would inspect thousands of lamps each day, checking for cracks, uneven glazing, or imperfect shapes. Any lamp that didn't meet his standards was discarded, representing lost materials and labor. But perfection was essential because his business model depended on producing lamps so consistently that customers would trust his brand across the empire. The key to his success wasn't innovation or creativity, it was standardization. Lucius developed production methods that ensured every lamp was identical to every other lamp. He created training programs for his slaves that focused on repetitive muscle memory rather than artistic expression. He built quality control systems that caught defects before they reached customers. And he did all of this while maintaining detailed records of costs, production rates, and profit margins that would make modern accountants proud. The work was so boring that Lucius often fell asleep standing up in his own workshops. But boring work that produced consistent results was exactly what the Roman economy needed. His lamps lit homes from Scotland to Egypt, and each one generated a tiny profit that, multiplied by millions of units, created enormous wealth. What made these methods so effective wasn't their complexity or their innovation. It was their relentless, mind-numbing consistency. While other Romans chased dramatic opportunities that promised quick riches, these successful merchants understood that true wealth comes from doing boring things extremely well, over and over again, for decades. And this brings us to the most important truth about Roman wealth building. The richest Romans weren't the ones who made headlines. They weren't the ones whose names were carved into marble or whose deeds were celebrated in epic poems. They were the ones who understood that wealth accumulation is fundamentally a boring process. A process that requires the kind of methodical patience that most people simply cannot sustain. Take the banking system, for instance. Roman banking wasn't the high-stakes financial maneuvering you might imagine. It was bookkeeping. Endless, meticulous bookkeeping. The Argentari, the professional bankers, spent their days hunched over wax tablets, recording transactions in handwriting so small it would strain modern eyes. They tracked loans, calculated interest, and maintained records with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive compulsion. A successful banker like Gaius Oppius would arrive at his stall in the forum before dawn, not to engage in dramatic financial negotiations, but to review ledgers from the previous day. He would check each entry twice, verify every calculation, and cross-reference loan payments with outstanding balances. The work was so repetitive that his fingers developed permanent calluses from holding styluses, and his back ached from bending over tablets for 12 hours a day. But this tedious attention to detail created something remarkable. Trust. In a world without modern banking regulations or insurance, trust was the most valuable commodity a banker could possess. And trust came from never making mistakes, never losing track of a deposit, never miscalculating interest, never failing to collect on a debt when it came due. The profit margins were predictable rather than spectacular. A typical loan might earn 3% interest per month, barely enough to cover the risks of default and currency fluctuation. But Oppius understood that predictable profits, compounded over decades, created more wealth than any single spectacular investment. He would lend money to merchants for grain shipments, to craftsmen for raw materials, to farmers for seed money. Each loan was small, boring, and carefully documented. By the time he retired, Oppius had processed thousands of loans, each one requiring the same meticulous attention to detail. He had never made a fortune on a single transaction, but his accumulated wealth was so vast that he could afford to buy entire city blocks in Rome, not through brilliance or luck, but through the mind-numbing repetition of basic banking principles. The secret, if there was one, lay in understanding that wealth building is essentially a mathematical process. It's about finding activities that produce consistent, positive returns, and then repeating those activities with machine-like precision. The Romans who got rich weren't the ones who sought excitement or novelty. They were the ones who found profitable routines and stuck to them with the determination of water wearing down stone. Consider the rental income model that made families like the Crassi wealthy for generations, not through dramatic real estate speculation, but through the boring process of property management. They would buy modest apartment buildings in working-class neighborhoods, then spend decades maintaining them with the enthusiasm of a monk copying manuscripts. The daily routine was mind-numbing, collecting rent from tenants who paid in small copper coins, repairing leaking roofs and broken doors, mediating disputes between neighbors who argued about noise, cooking smells, and shared courtyard spaces, keeping detailed records of income and expenses in ledgers that grew thick with the accumulated tedium of property management. But rental income had one crucial advantage. It was predictable. Every month, the same tenants paid the same rent for the same apartments. The amounts were small, but they were consistent, and consistency, compounded over time, created wealth that lasted centuries. Some Roman families collected rental income from the same properties for over 200 years, passing down not just the buildings themselves, but the boring expertise needed to manage them profitably. The beauty of these methods was their accessibility. You didn't need to be born into the patrician class or have connections to the imperial court. You didn't need special talents or brilliant insights. You just needed to be willing to do boring work consistently over long periods of time, without seeking recognition or excitement. This is why these stories are perfect for sleep, because they reflect the reality of wealth building in any era. Real wealth isn't created through dramatic moments or brilliant innovations. It's created through the slow, methodical repetition of profitable activities. Activities so boring that most people give up before they see results. Activities that require the kind of patience that our modern world has forgotten how to cultivate. The Romans understood something that we've lost. They understood that excitement and wealth creation are often inversely related. The most exciting opportunities are usually the riskiest ones. The most boring opportunities are usually the most reliable ones. And reliability, given enough time, always wins. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Marcus counting grain in dusty warehouses. Remember Gaius tasting olives with the intensity of a sommelier. Remember Lucius inspecting ceramic lamps until his eyes burned from the effort. Remember Oppius hunched over banking ledgers, calculating interest with the precision of a mathematician. These weren't exciting lives. They weren't lives that would make for thrilling movies or inspiring biographies. But they were lives that understood a fundamental truth about wealth. That true riches come not from seeking fortune, but from finding boring work that produces consistent returns, and then doing that work with unwavering discipline, day after day, year after year, until the small profits compound into something magnificent. And perhaps that's the most boring truth of all, that the path to wealth has always been the same, whether in ancient Rome or modern times. Find something that works. Do it consistently, wait patiently, and let time do the rest. The wealthy Romans didn't get rich through luck or genius. They got rich through boredom, through the willingness to repeat the same profitable activities day after day, month after month, year after year, until the compound effect of small gains created enormous fortunes. And maybe that's why their stories work so well as bedtime tales, because they remind us that real success isn't about dramatic moments or sudden breakthroughs. It's about the quiet discipline of showing up every day to do work that most people would find intolerably dull. Marcus Crassus inspecting grain shipments in the pre-dawn darkness. Gaius Tullius adjusting olive oil storage temperatures with the precision of a scientist. Lucius Vistorius examining thousands of ceramic lamps for microscopic flaws, Gaius Oppius calculating loan interest with fingers stained from stylus ink. These weren't heroes. They weren't conquerors. They were accountants, logistics managers, quality control specialists. They were the ancient equivalent of people who get rich by optimizing supply chains and managing inventory turnover rates. Their wealth came from understanding that money flows to those who solve boring problems consistently, that fortunes are built not through inspiration, but through perspiration, not through brilliance, but through persistence, not through seeking excitement, but through embracing the tedium that others avoid. The Roman Empire fell, the legions disbanded, the emperors were forgotten. But the principles that made these merchants wealthy, those endured, because they were based on mathematical truths that transcend empires and epochs. Small profits, repeated consistently, compound into vast wealth. Boring work, done with discipline, creates more value than exciting work done sporadically. And patience, the most boring virtue of all, remains the most powerful force in wealth creation. So as you settle into sleep tonight, let these ancient stories remind you of something profound, that the most reliable path to prosperity has always been the same. Find work that produces consistent returns. Do that work with methodical precision, and wait patiently while time transforms small gains into something magnificent. The Romans knew this. They lived it. They built fortunes through the sheer power of being willing to be bored, and their example echoes across the centuries, whispering a timeless truth into the darkness. That wealth isn't built through excitement. It's built through the quiet accumulation of profitable moments, one grain shipment at a time, one olive harvest at a time, one ceramic lamp at a time, until the boring work compounds into riches beyond imagination. Sleep well, knowing that the most powerful force in wealth creation isn't brilliance or luck. It's simply the willingness to do boring work consistently, day after day, until the mathematics of compound growth works its ancient magic. The Romans understood this, and now, so do you. Now,